Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. This is Chris Capola coming to you, good people, and I am joined today by Evan Buck. Evan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Murica, Buck, yeah.
Okay, you're kind of backing me into the corner that now I kind of can't use that as the intro music. I don't.
True. Yeah. Well, I figured due to our, unstated rules against vulgarity, we wouldn't be using that song, but I don't know.
I made it happen.
Hey, there you go. Just slap on the explicit label and full send.
No, I bleeped.
Okay, got it. Nice. But anyway, yes. And actually, for the record, I didn't say it. I said my last name. I use my last name as a pejorative.
Okay.
So yeah, so you don't technically have to.
Don't
bleep
worry.
it if you don't want to.
You're not the only one.
Yeah. But anyway, hello everyone. It is I, Evan Buck, and as I usually like to say, hey everyone, how's it going? It's your boy Evan.
So back with Murica Month. This was actually my suggestion, and do you want to kind of take it from here?
Sure.
You did the document.
Yeah, I did write the doc. So there you go. And before we dive fully into today's topic, I will just give that plug for Murica Month. Every week in July, we are going to be talking about issues related to the Revolutionary War. And so please continue to vote and talk on the Discord, because after this releases, I'll probably release another poll for the last two options, which one you guys want to see first and discuss first. This one was voted, and so now we're releasing it. So the one that was voted next was, what if the United States, or it wouldn't be called the United States at that point, but what if the 13 colonies in America had been given representation in British Parliament? And to kind of get an understanding of where this issue came from, a little bit of historical background on this is really we can see the seeds for this planted mainly in what is known as the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, as it's commonly referred to in American classrooms. And Chris did, before he comes in here with this little mini bomb that he'll drop, I'll just get that out of the way for him as well. It's called the 7 Years' War, but it really depends on where you define the start of said conflict, because like we like to say in World War II, does World War II really start with the Blitzkrieg of Poland? Or do we talk about how Japan invades China in 1937, and that's really the start of World War II?
Or also an argument of Pearl Harbor. A lot of Americans think that's the start of it.
Right, precisely. And so whatever you believe the actual genesis of the conflict is, it is commonly referred to as the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763. And it was during this conflict, which, really speaking of world wars, this was probably arguably the first global conflict. We say World War I, World War II, but I would say this is really the first global conflict, World War. It happened across 4 continents after all. So during this conflict, there's a lot in the North American frontier, the North American sphere, just a lot of sorting out and hashing out of differences between the French and the British, the age-old enemies, over different colonial claims. And because of this, the British Empire enlisted the help of a lot of the local militias, the local American colonists, to help in their mutual common defense. And wars are expensive, as I'm sure many people are well aware throughout history. It's sometimes not so much the war itself that is quite as devastating to a nation, although that definitely can be, as it is the economics and the economic theory of how do you pay for all this stuff? And when the conflict, either during the conflict or when the conflict is over, which countries really kind of start owning you and owning your stuff because you financed through those banks. And this was the issue that the British were starting to face, even though they ended up largely winning most of the issues in the French and Indian War. We had the Treaty of Paris, France surrendering all of its North American possessions east of the Mississippi to the British and Louisiana to the Spaniards. I won't dive into the specific issues of how this really was actually, panning out. And you can kind of compare the British to, new landlords taking over and maintaining the tenants that were in the area. I'm not going to get into all of that specifically, please. We might get into that later in the course of the episode, but be that as it may, the British take over a decent amount of land, and they now have to figure out how to pay for this war that they just won. So, from the American colonists' point of view, the British start slapping on some taxes on them through the Stamp Act, for example, and that kind of incenses some rich people in the colonies. And basically, a lot of human history can be boiled down into rich people trying to argue out of paying their taxes. And in this time period, there's really no exception to this. A lot of the colonists were not happy about this. There was also the British decided, hey, maybe it's a good idea to have some law and order and have some of our troops stationed in these colonies. So rabble-rousers and conflicts between the French people that are still in these areas and the Indians and the colonists that want to expand into these new territories. We should probably have some troops there to keep the peace. The British had actually also elucidated a policy that basically said, hey, the colonists can't go out and start frontiering in these new areas that we just won. So that's another thing that was kind of making the American colonists not too happy. So, with the aftermath of the French and Indian War, new taxes, new quartering of soldiers, all of these things, the colonists kind of start feeling like they're being treated as second-class citizens in the British Empire. And it was kind of an open secret that a lot of the British back across the pond, back in London, back in Westminster, they saw the Americans as backwater hicks in a lot of ways. The Americans, of course, took umbrage with this. They wanted to be seen as full-fledged, proper Englishmen. They, at this point, did not want to rise up and rebel against King George. They still saw themselves as loyal subjects, but they saw themselves as being deeply mistreated and taken advantage of. They saw the aftermath of the French and Indian War as them being asked to enlist their services for a conflict that really only benefited the empire, not really themselves. The British, of course, saw this a bit differently. They saw this as the Americans being ungrateful for the common defense that the crown provided them and all the money that they had expended for said common defense. So from the Brits' point of view, we're just kind of asking for their fair share, for them to pay up for all of what we were giving them during the 7 Years' War. With all of this in mind, then, this is what led to a lot of the Americans and the colonists seeing the taxes, rebelling against the taxes, successfully repealing, rolling back a lot of what was enacted during the Stamp Act, and just a lot of discontent with how the British were running the colonies. In our timeline, of course, this eventually leads to open conflict, armed rebellion, small little sparks that end up lighting into a massive fire of the American War for Independence and Revolution. But before we get to that point, this is where we're going to have our fork in time. In 1765, 2 years after the 7 Years' War was concluded, Britain passes the Stamp Act. They taxed a lot of stuff, legal documents, newspapers, even playing cards. Eventually, the Americans resist this and gets this repealed. And in October of that same year, the Americans basically sent over a trade proposal. They said, hey, we want you to give us representatives in Parliament and to repeal these onerous taxes. We don't like these things. So because of everything that we gave during the 7 Years' War, we think that we deserve a seat at the proverbial table. And we'll, of course, be getting into the specifics of what this means politically and in terms of how the British organized their their parliamentary system and their structure back in the late 1700s. We'll be getting that into the course of the episode. But for the sake of explaining the fork, just to keep it simple, the Americans want a seat at the table because they did not at this point have a specific seat at the parliamentary table across the pond. So in our timeline, the taxes were rolled back, but the representation was not given. The British did not think this was a good idea. They rejected it. In our episode today on the show, we're going to be saying that the British are going to accede to the Americans' demands and provide them representation in Parliament. So, Chris, what do we think this is going to change with regards to both sides of the Atlantic? Because I think in our pre-podcast discussion, my doc mainly focuses on changes in America. But Chris, you did have some very salient points about how this could change things with the British side. And we can touch upon that first if you want. We can talk about America first. Whatever you want to do.
So I think the important thing to think about when it comes to the U.S. colonies, the American colonies gaining representation in Britain, and I'm going to be very specific, in Westminster.
Yes.
Because that is the central parliament. And the reason that's important is, hey, again, like 1707, Scotland has the Act of Union, which basically disbands the independent Scottish Parliament and has all of Scotland ruled from Westminster. This is right in the middle, right before 1803, the Irish Act of Union, which disbands the Irish Parliament and has them represented directly in Westminster. So basically, like, the way that Britain has done this before and after it is, you gain representation in our parliament, but you no longer have any independent parliament, which I think would be a really big and interesting change for the American colonies. One thing that's going through my mind right now, and you know, I'm literally springing this on Evan. I'm sorry, I don't.
I mean, you find a way to do this almost every episode. So
I'm
what else is new?
No. Most of the time when I do it, I have plotted this out and know I'm doing it. I just intentionally have not told you.
Okay. So this is bringing it even on myself, on yourself.
Here's what I'm interested in thinking about. Hey, your Thomas Jeffersons, your James Madisons specifically, they can be represented in the Virginia House of Burgesses because they could be part-time legislators. They can go to Williamsburg, capital of Virginia at this point. When the colonial legislature is in session, or, you know, kind of more of the Massachusetts examples of your John Adams, he can just not take a legal case or any of these things. It actually changes who we can send and who our political leaders are if we're thinking about sending them 3 months on a 3-month trip just to sit in Parliament. So I think that might be an interesting issue to come across.
Yeah, that is fascinating to think about that. And that actually does touch on something I wanted to mention very much, is that if you read through my doc, you basically get this idea that I have a case of cognitive dissonance, because I really do. Like, based upon where we could possibly take this fork, there's from what I could identify on the internet and just within my own musings on the subject, I could see two overarching ways that this could go, just depending on how one thinks through the issue. But if you look at this idea of taxation without representation, I put it in heavy air quotes, a lot of the political theory at the time, and from what historians say on this after the fact, is It's not really necessarily the representation that's the biggest problem here, that the colonists are kind of mad about. They're, for the most part, mad about taxation and what they perceive as British overreach on taxation policies, and their lack of a voice in those proceedings is part and parcel of that, of course. But, if you give them a choice of give them a representative in Parliament or have the taxes rolled back, they would have been more than fine with staying with the status quo in terms of how the political structure was arranged if the taxes weren't so onerous and just imposed willy-nilly on them.
I'm reminded of in the U.S., in the American state of Washington, Eastern Washington regularly wants to try and break away from the rest because the rest of the state is what's called King County, i.e. Seattle, where like 75% of the people live. Point being this.
Well, I mean, that's like the whole greater Idaho movement too, like Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington, northeastern-ish California. Like there's a lot of those people in the rural parts of the states that want to break away.
That's one of the points is like
state of Jefferson.
Hey, when you have representation based upon population, which by the way, we'll get back to Britain not doing this at all. We can talk about that instead.
Yeah.
When you're outvoted, you get taxed, you get these laws put in place. And by the way, there is absolutely no way that the British Parliament is, they will give Americans representation, just not enough to actually change the outcome of it.
Yeah, and that's a big practical problem that I thought about here is it's like, okay, you give them a few seats at the table, but they're still going to get outvoted by everybody else. So is this really going to pragmatically actually change anything? So we have the American colonial point of view mainly arguing against taxes, not as much for representation, although that was, again, definitely part and parcel of what they wanted. But the other issue to think about is we don't live in the era of Zoom meetings at this point. We don't have virtual representation, and that's something that we'll get into as well. That means something different in this time period than it does now. But we don't have the ability to instantly and effortlessly send messages back and forth. It takes 4 months on a boat to cross the Atlantic to even take a letter. And then guess what? It takes another 4 months to send the reply back. So essentially, even if everything goes instantly, you're going to have 2/3 of the year basically with what happened in Westminster being sent to the States and then what happens in the States being sent back. It's the time delay is absolutely magnificently significant. And so with the practical sense of being outvoted still in Parliament and with communication being efficient and effective, like it's able to happen relatively decently if you're on the other side of the pond. But at this point, the technology just isn't there. So with those two issues in mind, my first potential thought on this is this might not really change much of anything. Like, okay, they're given
forestalling a revolution.
Forestalling the revolution for maybe a few years at most. We're given a couple seats at the table, we meaning the Americans, but it doesn't directly handle the taxation question. In fact, the British could use this as a way to sidestep the taxation question and be like, hey, we'll give you seats at the table. Now, kindly shut thy traps.
Well, I think the other thing to point out is that if the United States, if the American colonies are treated like Great Britain, like other British subjects in Britain, like let's assume we work everything out and, the American colonies, each colony elects 2 representatives to go to Westminster. And, everybody agrees on this date, they become members of Parliament and all American colonists are treated and under the exact same law as somebody in London. The taxes on the American colonists are going to skyrocket as soon as you just apply the same taxes to them as everybody in Great Britain is paid.
Yep, exactly. So you got that issue as well. And I think it is interesting when we look at, the interwar period, I guess you can call it, between the 7 Years' War and the War for Independence, because we actually have some guys in Britain prominent guys who are essentially seeing the issue, from a mile away. And they're like, hey guys, we should probably do something about this. And the two most prominent voices are Edmund Burke and William Knox. And they're sitting there and they're like, hey, guys, the British Empire, we got to modernize. We got to change with the times. Those rabble-rousers are kind of causing some issues for us. We might want to think about changing how we do things here. And Burke was a little bit more of the less radical guy. He was like, hey, we should give them a little more autonomy. We should, keep them, of course, subordinate to Parliament and to Great Britain, but maybe we should give them a little bit more control. I'm not going to necessarily say this is the one example that springs to mind. Not necessarily as extreme as a, Denmark-Greenland situation, but maybe in effect and practicality, essentially that's what would happen. Knox, on the other hand, he's like, hey, we need to give the Americans full representation in Parliament. And Chris, I think this is actually an excellent point of departure for you to talk about some of the changes that we could see happening in this alternate timeline being accelerated by a few decades.
So, first idea is the rotten borough, which is a kind of, we have listeners in the United Kingdom, and I always love when they sign in and say, oh, yeah, everybody knows about that. No. Basically, I am going to...
For the record, I did not know about this.
I'm going to offend Eric Rush and say that the best way for an American to understand a rotten borough is imagining the state of Wyoming.
I need to find my Wyoming t-shirt right now.
The thing is this. So basically, every American is very familiar with redistricting. It's literally now a year-round thing. The British Parliament at this point did not do that. And the British Parliament is kind of an argument as to why you do need to do it. Because at this point, basically the constituency map had been piecemealed and drawn over the past 300-400 years and had never been updated. And what that means is, as industrialization is starting, as you start having the agricultural revolution and the birth of cities, the maps haven't kept up with it. That means that there are some places, for example, the city of Manchester, which is, I guess, the best way to describe Manchester would be like Great Britain's Chicago. I think is a good way to kind of imagine it. Did not have any representation. It had 2 representatives from the county it was in, because when the maps were drawn, it had not grown. It was
not there yet.
Small.
Right.
So you have some places that have nowhere near enough representation. You also have some cities that used to be there, don't have anybody that lives there anymore, but still have representatives in Parliament, because that map was drawn 200 years ago when there used to be a village there. That village still has representation. And I think one of the things that, when the American colonists come to Westminster and open up these books and start discussing this, there's a reason they wrote into the Constitution the census and how often we change our maps.
Yep,
because they saw this as a problem. So
we want to talk about redistricting. We want to talk about gerrymandering. A lot of that has roots in this kind of stuff that happened in the British system.
But it was started to fix this problem.
But it was started to fix the issue. And now maybe one could argue we swung too far to the other side of the pendulum swing. But we won't get into that this episode. This isn't a poli-sci episode.
So basically, in the process of fixing this, of coming to some agreement where Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania are all going to have seats in Parliament, they're probably going to open up and ask the question of, why do cities that no longer exist have as many votes as Philadelphia,
Right.
Boston, New York?
Well, and this is where I think it's good to throw in the idea of virtual representation as well, because, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, Chris, but when you have these, I guess you can call them ghost legislators, right? When you have these people who represent areas that don't really have any population anymore, who don't exist, they were essentially recognized by Parliament as representing all of the British Empire's interests,
It
right?
wasn't official. It wasn't.
Yeah, it was kind of a more of a
it wasn't like a
operational
you are our
thing.
special imperial overarching at large people. The
Yeah.
argument was because you don't have actual people constituents, your interests are not to bring home pork barrel projects for them. Your loftier ideals are to serve you can be the super delegates.
De facto super delegates.
And not, by the way, to just keep securing your lifetime job. Not literally, you don't even have to.
I can see this playing out so well in the American system, where you have people who are representing districts that don't have any people in them, and they are totally not going to use this for corruption at all.
or the fact that, look at this and say, rather than serving the higher purpose, I could do whatever because I don't even have
I don't have people to answer to.
Who am I going to be primaried by?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So that is the virtual representation that we were talking about earlier, now coming back into play. So essentially, Chris, what we're saying is that if we have this change, we give each colony, a certain number of seats in Parliament. This is more likely than not going to lead to an overhaul of this rotten borough system, or way earlier than it was in our timeline, because that happened in what, the 1820s, 1830s in our timeline?
1830s.
The 1830s, yeah. So we're dealing with this, accelerating it by like 70-ish years. Not only is this, because, I think Chris, when you said this as a possible topic, and when people hear this idea of giving the United States representation before the Revolutionary War, I'll ADHD myself into this as well, just to loop this in so I don't forget. We had an episode a long time ago. I think this was in 2020, when Don was still the main head of the show. He talked about the olive branch petition being granted by King George in episode 60. We can link that in the show notes for a, interesting callback and discussion on that. But I think a lot of people would think of this context of giving representation to the Americans in that sort of pre-revolutionary, but revolutionary things have still happened sort of context, right? We have the, what was it, like the Boston Massacre. We have the Boston Tea Party. We have, these things, these opening shots that have already occurred. What I find interesting about this fork is that we're dealing with something when the Americans are still very much British subjects, still see themselves very much as British subjects. And even up until the Olive Branch petition was basically saying, hey, we're still loyal to King George. We need a lot of changes to happen, and we need them stat. And once that was rejected, then that kind of opened the floodgates. But be that as it may, Olive Branch petition still happened when a lot of Americans basically gave up on that idea and were like, no, we're revolutionary now. We're going to break away. We're doing everything we can to make ourselves a more perfect union. We're talking about a time period just a decade earlier where the environment is very much different. And I think that's what makes this fork quite fascinating is again, like I said, I think most people, when you hear this idea, you're thinking of it in the context of a lot of Revolutionary War things and pre-Revolutionary War things that have happened. We're still, the only thing that really has happened up until this point is the Stamp Act.
Right.
We didn't even have the sugar taxes, the tea taxes, which led to the Boston
by the way, we're
Party.
going to as soon as that equalization happens, but
well, right, we certainly will, but then it'll be the alternate timelines version of that, not our timelines version of that in a different context. So I forget where I was going with all of that, but essentially the idea is so we're going to have the British system given an overhaul and an update much sooner than it does in our timeline. So what does this do for both sides of the pond? Because I can see things happening with certain Emerald Isle noises happening
So
sooner.
that's interesting. I think what happens before then and actually leads to the Emerald Isle noises is the French noise.
Yes.
Basically, in our timeline, the French Revolution happens, Napoleon happens, and the French government is pretty openly trying to use discontent in Ireland as a springboard to, if not actually invade Britain, to actually extend some of its power and distract Britain
Well, I mean, it's
from.
why the French got involved in the American Revolution, is because they are going to find any opportunity to try and stick it to the British.
Right.
So they are going to lack that in this timeline. The Americans are going to be much more joined to the hip
They're
to the
going to
British.
lack that in like the 1700s.
Well, they're going to try. They're probably still going to try, but
by what I'm saying is by the 1790s.
yeah.
One of the things I talked about, I think earlier, is Europe in general is on this schedule. You could almost say
Yeah.
that every 15 to 20 years, they're going to go to war with each other. You have Austrian secession, you have Spanish secession, you have the 7 Years' War, you have the American Revolution, which is a colonial project, but it draws in France, Britain, all of them.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have the Napoleonic Wars. Basically, it's going to happen again. And maybe the French Revolution is put off a little bit if they're not spending money on the American Revolution.
Yeah.
But structurally, France cannot sustain itself.
Mm-hmm.
And if they don't collapse into a internal revolutionary war, Russia is going to want to take another bayonet or something that's going to just bring all of Europe into another war.
Yep. Absolutely.
So
I 100% agree.
The interesting thing is, what does the United States, what do the American colonies do? I think the easiest thing to do is assume somehow around kind of Napoleon's rise, late 1790s. Maybe it's not even Napoleon. Maybe France hasn't gone through a revolution, like I said. Maybe it's somewhere else. Somebody else started something up. Britain is going to be at war with France. That's a given.
It's a given. It's a guarantee at some point.
And I think what's going to be really interesting is, so I'm going to take a step back and go back to the American role in the 7 Years / French and Indian War. We're raising militias, and George Washington is fighting at Pittsburgh and all of these things. We're not actually doing anything in Europe, American colonies. And in fact, the United States, the American colonies aren't even sending militia troops to the single battle that settles the war in North America, the Battle of Quebec, the Battle of the Battle at the Plains of Abraham, right outside the city of Quebec. Which fun side story. I have to do this. I thought I was going to do this. Plains of Abraham are why my sister has a record with the Canadian Internal Security Service. Went up there on a family vacation, and my father and I, being the history people, went out to see the old forts at the Plains of Abraham. My mother and sister had no interest in doing that whatsoever, so they stayed in the city of Quebec, and went to this nice concert and wound up on stage singing. They don't speak a word of French and have no idea what it is. It was a Quebecois separatist rally.
Oh no. Oh no. That's comedy. That's gold.
Um, Fast forward, however many years it winds up being, um, the American. I keep wanting to say the United States, but the
I
American
know. We keep wanting to say that.
are going to play a role similar to Canada in 1914.
Mm-hmm.
And Australia and New Zealand in 1914.
Yeah. Well, and essentially, just to kind of boil down this concept, is 7 Years' War participation and involvement was they, raised up militias, they did a lot of work, but they were not in Europe, and they were not in the main battle that settled the war and the question. With this forthcoming conflict being, American being given more representation, being kind of elevated in terms of their status politically, these political reforms happening. Well, now they are being asked to lend a very significant hand in a distinctly European conflict.
Mhm.
They're being sent across the ocean. So, and we can elucidate on more what we talked about in the pre-podcast, but essentially to simplify it down, if you are sending your boys and sending, raising up militias and doing a lot to help the mothership back in Europe, and you've already been given a lot of concessions, what are you going to want more of? You're gonna want more, not just representation, but recognition for the effort that you are putting forward.
I think I'm going to call it the 1920 example because we're already talking about something else being the First World War, whatever. I think the 1914-18 example is interesting because it is it provides a renewed vigor for the British Empire to re-examine its relationship with the Dominions, with Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. And basically, one of the, in Great Britain, this is one of the things you always hear about Americans talking about. Gee, back there you had to own land to vote. That is a true statement. I think you're going to see, and by the way, the property, the wealth requirement for voting in an election in Great Britain wasn't removed until 1920. Majority of it was lowered and lowered and lowered. You had people at the Somme that could not vote. I think once Westminster concedes representation, that's the next step, which is suffrage, which is you see Americans pushing for, because keep in mind, it was a patchwork. It was done colony by colony, state by state. But in the United States, in the beginning, there were also property requirements. And I think you're going to see some of that as the push post-war concession. What I was talking about kind of before the podcast is it's actually kind of unusual in the 1760s that Great Britain decides to put more responsibility on the colonial subjects. Kind of, if you're talking about Burke, I have to talk about Rousseau and the social contract.
Oh yes, got to go for that.
Where you're putting rights and responsibilities of citizenship.
Yeah.
What is the relationship between the individual and the state? And the reason I say that is...
And this is where the founders have all of their relationship with John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and all this stuff. This is where, in our timeline's distinctly American system, we create a Republican form of government. Now, sorry, not to interrupt what you're saying too much on your train of thought, Chris, but I think what's important to understand is these ideas are still going to be there. The guys that we're talking about, it's just going to be within the confines of a completely different political structure. Because
and
Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, these guys are going to still be around.
right,
And as you mentioned and alluded to before, they are probably going to be, a good number of them are going to be these parliamentary representatives.
some of them maybe.
Some of them.
I'm not sure how many of them are going to up six and move to Great Britain, which is what this is.
Well, yeah, because a lot of them have significant holdings and financial interests in the colonies.
But hey, I can literally see the comment written by a certain fan of ours in a island off the British Isles. It was not uncommon for absentee landlords in Ireland. Many people, especially, this was one of the big deals during the famine. You had people that owned the land, owned the property, owned the deed to it, had never been there. So that the travel burden is a lot less on them, and yet they still never visited what they own. But what I'm getting at is, after every big war that Great Britain was involved in, there was, if you could close your eyes and picture the scales of balance, there were a couple more weights dropped on the right side of that equation.
Mm-hmm.
After the Napoleonic Wars, you had the reform movement that led to the Peterloo Massacre, but also the abolition of slavery, the push that literally got rid of these rotten boroughs that I was talking about. Those that started lowering the property qualifications even just to vote. That is kind of a response to us needing something from our people during the Napoleonic War, during the period right after the First World War. You had the removal of property requirements, and you also had women's suffrage, because, again, we had to rely on a certain segment of the population.
We had to rely upon them during wartime. So
you also had a changing of the relationship between Great Britain and, again, the settler dominions, Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. You had a renegotiation of that. After the Second World War, you had the Attlee government coming in with the NHS and all of their reforms, and also, again, renegotiating the social contract with India, with Africa, with all of their colonial possessions. It's so amazing to think and realize the one time that the British government did not add rights to somebody after a war was the 7 Years' War.
Precisely. And it led to us as Americans and ending up, declaring independence, articulating Declaration of Independence, Constitution, this whole new idea and concept of, being a positive and negative rights, which have been theories for a while. We based a lot of our system on English common law, ancient Roman, Greek ideas, whatever. Again, I emphasize a lot of those things would still, probably be thought about, articulated, debated, but within a much different system and a much different, broader context of what is the relationship between headquarters, mothership, and the dependencies. And I think that's a very fascinating road to take it, because you mentioned something that I want to key on a little bit here, and that is the idea of slavery, because it was such an animating factor in the American experiment and, the Civil War, everything that led up to the Civil War. I mean, but in our timeline, like, Great Britain notably gets rid of the slave trade in 1807. Slavery is still, technically legal, but you can't now trade slaves. But in the early 1830s, I think it was 1834, they got rid of slavery completely. Of course, that's a lot earlier than what happened in the United States. And so I think what I can see possibly potentially happening is this continued back and forth between the American colonies and the British central headquarters mothership of, and we can term them flashpoints, whatever we want to call them as flashpoints. I can see it continue to be, and it can be about slavery. It can be about, having to help in the Napoleonic, or we'll call it the next European conflict, right? It's just a continued back and forth, tug and pull, give and take between the colonies and between the central headquarters of what are our rules, what are our responsibilities, and what do we give each other in return? I pat my back, you pat, yours kind of situation. What is that relationship? And I'm just going to say right now, I could see the slavery issue being something. I'm not going to necessarily go as far to the point where it's going to touch off the actual like alternate timelines American Revolution, but I think I can see it being a very contentious and fractious issue.
So
Now there is going to be a different context here because the North and the South are going to look a lot different. I think it's going to be fascinating to think about, like I mentioned in the 1760s, the British didn't allow the American colonists to move into these new areas. So we have the possibility of like Indian representation in Parliament because
no, we don't. Not really.
Not really.
I'll tell you that right now.
But I mean, let me pull this thread of thought through completely because I don't know what's necessarily going to happen or change there. But what I am going to say is like, look at the War of 1812. Part of the British war aims in the War of 1812 was to create an independent, like Indian buffer state, essentially, and that would help serve their interests. Again, very
solely because they've lost the United States.
We're right, exactly.
I think the proclamation line of 1763, which you're talking about, which basically said no American settlement over the Appalachian, that doesn't survive the negotiations.
Yeah, and what I was going to say is that was more so a pragmatic reality of we just spent a ton of money, blew a ton of money on fighting against the French. And the last thing we want right now is we're trying to recoup our investment and start taxing the Americans a bit more is another conflict between different settlers, between the Indians and the colonists, whatever. We just want to maintain the peace.
By the way, this idea almost that the colonists are kind of like a Leroy Jenkins. If you look at how the war started, like basically, George Washington got up on a horse, went out charging, and vastly exceeded what he was supposed to be doing, and got his nose bloodied because he was where he shouldn't have been doing things he shouldn't have been doing. And that didn't really start the full war because there was still fighting, but then it died down and neither side really prosecuted it. But I could definitely see a Britain being, I'm going to make a comparison, and I may be one of the only people that gets it. I'm okay with that. Japanese Continental Army, which was the Japanese army in Manchuria, except it had in the period between 1931 and kind of the end of World War II. And it almost conducted an independent policy where it could go out and, Quantum Army caused the Marco Polo Bridge incident, caused a series of incidents because the army wanted to go to war with China. I could see Britain being afraid that the colonials are going.
The Americans are going to pull something like that.
Yes.
Yeah, I could totally see that.
That's kind of what George Washington did.
Yeah, let's definitely be for real on that. Yeah. And so what I think is interesting, just thinking about all the ramifications of this, is the relationship between the the American colonies and the British. And this is something, Chris, that you name dropped, briefly in the pre-podcast discussion, but I'll just kind of bring it out into the open now, is, how we have this distinction between like Canada and the United States in our timeline? Well, is that distinction as big a deal in the alternate timeline, or does it even necessarily exist? So that is an interesting question.
That's an interesting question. I also have to throw this out there. Again, this is one of those other things that just literally did come to me. Britain also has possessions going the other direction. Jamaica.
Right.
And some of the Western Antilles. And probably also Saint-Domingue, Haiti, after the war with France. those areas are British holdings in the Americas, the same as Georgia, the same as South Carolina, same as Virginia. They were not very happy when the British Empire ended the slave trade and ended slavery. But in this timeline, I think you might actually see an interesting split between the northern United States and Canada. Basically, it's Civil War plus, because the areas which we consider the United States, the North, have Canada added to them.
Yeah.
At the same time, the Confederacy has the Caribbean added as well, because they have the same economic motives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which I think is an interesting thing to ponder. But the question to me would be, okay, the nature of that conflict, is that going to be, all of them are still British colonial holdings, and we are having what would be termed the South or the Confederacy in this alternate timeline? Is that a war for their independence over the slavery issue? Or is that they're still fighting within the overall system? Because we have now decades more of this precedent of, if we have significant issues, we are not going to try and declare our independence. We are going to try and work at the concessions through Westminster, because we now have a seat at the table, because we have representation. That's what I think is interesting to think about. And we have, of course, the Rottenborough reforms. That to me is an open question.
I'm going to try and close that question.
Yes, do it.
Missouri Compromise of 1850, Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Confederacy, in the winter of 1860 to 61, was already in a system where they had a say, and there had been negotiations over slavery.
Right.
When slavery was threatened, they took their ball and went home and said, we're not part of this system. So I don't see how adding in anybody else into this conference, I don't see how adding Edinburgh into this, the right honorable gentleman from Edinburgh is going to
how is that going to change the dynamics?
Walk away.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that's very interesting.
Now,
and I would tend to agree with that.
There is another interesting thought, which I'm going to explore here, because I don't have an answer to it yet. However, maybe being part of the British system would help the slavery cause, because you have the textile manufacturing in Great Britain that had, in our timeline, they were just arguing for it within the confines of kind of the British polity. They are a natural ally to the representatives from the southern colonies.
Well, I was going to say, the South wanted recognition from who, and help from who? The British.
So I think there might be an interesting internal dynamic playing out within Westminster, because that is the polity at this point, between the forces within our timeline to Great Britain that wanted abolition, the forces within our timeline to Great Britain that wanted to keep slavery, matched with the split representation from all of the American colonies too, because I think you're going to have an interesting argument of, and this is another thing, if you look at some of those British Caribbean islands, they're likely to get some form of representation. What does their suffrage look like when you got a situation where you got 10 English people on an island of a couple hundred? You can't let anybody else vote.
There's nobody else that can vote. I was going to say, just keeping it blunt. You have 10 to 100 Englishmen who, for all intents and purposes, own, and I mean literally own the means, all the means of production, and I mean human capital, machinery, everything, the slaves, whatever, those slaves are not really considered people. They're not going to have representation. It's just the 10 to 100 Englishmen that
So
represent that area.
you're going to see when, assuming it happens in the same time frame as ours does, it's going to come up when you start
Oh,
having
yeah.
these debates in Westminster. You're going to have a different alignment of forces on either side of it. And
Yeah.
I'm not even sure which side it strengthens versus which side it weakens. I think one of the interesting things about kind of the economic pro-slavery people in Great Britain is they could wash their hands of it and say, we don't own anybody. We're not actually, we have no problem doing this because we set up almost like the Southern United States was like a shell company for them. We could just keep buying the cheap cotton. We don't ask questions about how they do it. But because it's part of the same polity now, they're going to have to make a different argument.
Right. No, that's kind of what I was starting to lean towards when you were asking that question, is I'm like, there is a degree of plausible deniability that no longer exists in the alternate timeline. So you're still going to have like the William Wilberforces. You're still going to have the very adamantly pro-abolition arguments. You'll have more, I would say, people speaking up for the slavery interests on the other side of the aisle. Personally, I see this being an issue that leads to I'm not going to say more explosive conflict because that's kind of hard to define, but I'm going to say more so later on down the road in the alternate timeline, and probably earlier than our timeline's version of the Civil War. We'll call it the 1830s, I guess, functionally, when Britain decides we're going to abolish slavery. I can see that being an earlier touching off point because you can't really look the other way. If they're part of your polity, if they're part of your system, and you are deciding for the entire system that slavery is no longer possible, I don't really see functionally, just to keep things simple, I don't see them carving out an exception. I don't see them. I mean, the other thing to keep in mind as well, we want to talk about economic theory. The industrial power of the North,
by the way,
is in whose hands?
No. I'm bringing this up.
Okay. All right. Go for this.
We are far into this episode. We're almost back to the point where the chats start going back and forth about bringing this to a close.
Right. Yes, exactly.
And you wrote the dam of economic theory.
Let the parliamentary record show. Let the minutes show. Exactly. Very good point. But just getting back to what I was saying, who's in the British fold at this point? Not only do we have the South and their textiles and everything, but we have the industrial power of the North as well.
Do we?
I mean, unless I somehow missed a right turn in Albuquerque where the North was able to break away and declare independence. I was still operating under the assumption that the American colonies were still in the empire at this point.
Well, we're not even going to talk about Albuquerque because that's technically Mexico still.
However, exactly right.
The reason I talk and wonder about that is this: the American North industrially, think about John C. Calhoun and the nullification crisis. A lot of that is over the tariffs that the United States government put on British products, basically to allow the North to industrialize, protected from foreign competition. If Western Massachusetts is in the same polity as Birmingham, they may not be able to develop.
There might not be that emphasis, is what you're saying.
Industrially, if they're part of the same free trade policy.
True. That is actually a very interesting point. Very good point. Something I hadn't thought about while we were going down this rabbit hole.
Oh, yeah, no, I know when you're like, wait, what do you mean they're not? Yeah.
Right. What's the cause of that? Exactly.
I smelled some blood in that war.
Nah, 100%. I think that was good to be called out on that for sure. But anyway, I think that's probably about as good a time as any to, maybe start wrapping things up here. I think we have a very interesting alternate world, and where things start, the fault lines start appearing, the fractures, whatever the nature of that is. I do think having a world where America stays in the British Empire, the British fold for longer, is certainly a very fascinating one.
Even just through Napoleon, that's
right.
going to be interesting.
Yeah, that is, I think, very fascinating for sure. I mean, I do think the main central takeaway for me on this is, despite my initial research suggesting that the representation issue alone probably wouldn't have forestalled the revolution that much, because, well, it was really mainly about taxes and not so much about there not being guys in Westminster to represent us because of the logistical challenges. But really, when you take that in tandem with what the other dominoes would fall as a result of that change, and that's where I think you kind of start seeing, as Don would often say, the ripples from that stone being tossed. That's where I think you have an America that stays in the British fold for longer, and the massive possible changes that happen as a result of that, for sure. But yeah, I think that's about all that I wanted to mention. Here, I'm just scanning over my doc just to see if there's any other last minute things I wanted to mention. I always like to throw in some little crazy thing. But Chris, do you have something that you want to throw in before we draw this to a close?
Not really.
No? Yeah, I think we covered it pretty well. I guess just the very last thing that I didn't mention that I'll throw in is, we are going to live in a world that has no Monroe Doctrine, at least for a while. So kind of similar to what we talked about in the Little Brothers Club, where we contemplated an America that had a monarchy that was much more tied to Europe. It's not the same exact argument, but I would say it rhymes. Thematically, it rhymes.
I think we do have an effective Monroe Doctrine.
Well, this is kind of thing where it's like you had the de facto virtual representation. We might have a de facto form of a Monroe Doctrine that's not articulated, but it is functionally existing.
Looking at the history of the Monroe Doctrine, it was actually supposed to be jointly declared with Great Britain, because Great Britain had the naval power to stop,
to project that,
any other European colonial power from coming to the Americas. And the reason they wanted to do that, and the reason the United States wanted to do it, is because we had industrial development.
Right, which
our timeline
actually
ignored. But still, somebody has this industrial development that has the ability to mass produce goods and sell them very cheaply to the Latin American republics.
Well, and you you have British naval power that is actually going to be directly projected, because we still have the quartering of troops there. We still have a British, and I would say a much stronger British naval presence there over the course of this alternate timeline. So I actually like that point. I like that a lot. But yeah, I think this is a revolutionless timeline. We don't have the War for Independence. We don't have the Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party, all of those things. But eventually, where things kind of maybe start converging with our timeline is whenever the alternate timeline's equivalent of a civil war happens. That's where I can see, not the exact same, because it's going to be a very different America, the very different nature. We might have, like you said, Chris, a Caribbean plus the South as this alternate timelines confederacy.
By the way, I think another interesting thing is New Spain.
Right. I mean, and we didn't really even touch upon that much at all, but that was something that I'm interested in seeing traced down the timeline as well, is the nature of other European powers in North America. How does this change the nature of that?
You mean Mexico? There's no other European powers in.
Right.
I'm talking about how do we still wind up with Texas? Are you coming to us from the United States, or
Yeah.
are you out in San Diego? Yeah.
Yeah. No, that I think would be very fascinating to trace down the timeline if we were to continue on this. But I do think we delivered for y'all a very nice wrapped package with a bow on top for the purposes of Murica Month. Because we are going to be tackling other issues relating to the Revolutionary War for the rest of July. So, with all that being said, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in to this episode of A Fork in Time. Like I said at the start of the show, we are going to have a couple more topics left to play with after this, so I'll run another poll, talk about it.
Maybe we won't. Maybe if this episode bombs in the polls, maybe this is our last one.
That's right. I am going to say this one is one that's ranking high right now, but we don't know. Maybe this will end up tanking.
Because unlike I feel like this podcast, in determining Murica Month, has hit the sweet spot. We have figured out the proper balance between rotten boroughs and redistricting.
That is actually right. Yes, in terms of how we run this podcast, we've come to a pretty good compromise and sweet spot. So there you go. I love that. So anyway, guys, thank you. However you choose to participate in Murica Month, whether that's in continuing to vote in the polls and discuss on the Discord, or just talk about how silly our points are on the Discord, because this is the last episode, we greatly look forward to and anticipate your feedback. Thank you so much for tuning in, everyone. And as we always like to ask at the end of these episodes, if you come across a fork in time, what do you think we should do with it?
Redistrict it so that somehow there's a district that runs down the yellow dotted line in the middle of the road to connect two different blocks uniquely voting together, but not either other side of the road.
And ensure that the fork is in a district that actually has representation for it.
That has
population, that has people living in it.
Well, yeah,
exactly.
No, you need the fork to connect the two voting blocks. So they're in the same district.
Yeah, exactly. That makes sense. Well, the way we usually answer that question, in the vein of Yogi Berra's famous quote, is if you stumble across a fork in time, we think you should take it. See y'all next time, everyone. Take care.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.